Our first speaker is Professor Lois McNay. Lois McNay is Professor of Theory of Politics in the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Oxford, and she's also a Fellow of Somerville College, Oxford. She specialises in continental social theory and feminist thought, particularly the work of theorists such as Foucault and Bourdieu, but she's also written a great deal about feminist theorists such as Nancy Fraser. Lois's books include Foucault and Feminism, Gender and Agency, and most recently, Against Recognition. And Lois's talk today is titled Political Ontologies and Radical Democracy. I'll invite Lois to speak for 30 minutes, and then we'll have a paper from David Owen for 30 minutes, and there'll be opportunity for questions at the end of both papers. So please join me in welcoming Lois McNay.
It is an honour and a pleasure for me to speak at this symposium, because amongst all the many significant things that have been written about progressive democratic politics, and especially feminism during the last few decades, it is the work of Nancy Fraser that has consistently been one of the most important sources of intellectual inspiration to me. Over the years, I have turned to her work time and again when thinking through some problem or other, and have always found it an invaluable source of insight and intellectual orientation. If I were to try to explain what it is about her work that I find particularly inspiring, it is, at the most basic level, her commitment to realising a mode of political thought that is associated with, although no longer monopolised by, the critical theory tradition, namely the derivation of normative ideas of emancipation from the analysis of existing inequalities and social injustices, or, as Nancy Fraser puts it, to conceptualise society in a way that makes visible its historical fault lines, revealing the contradictions and emancipatory potentials that mark a given time and place. This idea of critique entails, amongst other things, that normative thought should not be freestanding, but must be self-consciously interdisciplinary in nature, involving, above all, an exchange between social and political theory. The lineaments of an ideal society should not be arrived at through abstract logical reflection, but through negative sociological scrutiny of existing inequalities and of political struggles to overcome them. Much, of course, has been written about the intertwinement of fact and norm expressed in this idea of critique, and I'm not going to go into any of that other than to note that it is an idea that is as frustrating as it is suggestive, for even as it proposes a dialectical cross-disciplinary approach to idealising thought, it does not seem to lead to any particular method or precise intellectual focus. In my view, however, more than any other thinker today, more even than the most well-known contemporary exponents of the critical theory method, Habermas and Honneth, it is the work of Nancy Fraser that provides one of the most imaginative and fruitful examples of this style of political thinking that constantly moves between fact and norm, that derives ideals from the critique of power. For me, what makes her work especially significant is it stands as an important corrective to a prevailing tendency in contemporary political thinking, where the crucial task of identifying and challenging existing forms of injustice and domination has been somewhat marginalised in favour of an ontological mode of theorising about the political. In the wake of debates about identity politics and the dead end it was seen to lead to, there has been a pronounced ontological turn in contemporary political theory of all stripes towards thinking about the quintessential dynamics of the political in the kind of transcendental mode famously exemplified by Schmitt. This abstract mode of theorising has been given further urgency by the social transformations set in train by globalisation, many of which, it appears, can be most effectively dealt with from within a more universal political frame. As a result, ontologies of the political currently abound in contemporary political thought. There are numerous versions of deliberative and cosmopolitan democracy inspired by the work of Rawls and Habermas, Arendtian and Foucauldian versions of agonist democracy, the work of Linda Zerilli, James Tully, Bonnie Honig, Derridian accounts of democracy to come, Chantal Mouffe and Ernesto Laclau and Zizek, left Heideggerian theories of radical democracy, Badiou, Nancy, Lefort, and so on. This ontological turn has certainly breathed new life into political theory. As Agnes Heller puts it, the concept of the political came to the rescue of political philosophy. It saved it, quote, after it had fallen victim to too much science, too much compromise, too much realism. But it also has certain troubling entailments. one of which is that it increasingly tends towards what could be called, to borrow a phrase from Bourdieu, a socially weightless way of thinking about the world that abstracts from power relations in such a questionable way that ultimately the emancipatory force of some of its central normative categories is thrown into doubt. This criticism of social weightlessness has obviously been levelled in various ways at analytical styles of political thought and to a lesser extent at Habermasian theories of discourse ethics, especially in their latest rarefied incarnation as theories of cosmopolitanism. But I'm not interested in those today. The problem I want to consider here is social weightlessness in types of radical democratic thought, theories of agonist democracy to be precise, that proceed from the recognition of the constitutive nature of power relations and would therefore be sceptical about notions of the political that claim to transcend them. Yet, despite maintaining that power is an ineradicable feature of the political, these agonist theories often finish by eradicating it from their notions of democratic practice. Let me be clear, this is not an argument against abstraction per se. It is rather an argument about how some theories of radical democracy have become caught in received or reified abstractions, which, when subjected to a certain type of sociological scrutiny, prove to be less emancipatory than is claimed. My focus, as usual, will be on the concept of agency and the tendency of agonist thinkers to conceive of radical political action through abstract and phenomenologically restricted ideas of undecidability and indeterminacy. As ever, Nancy Fraser's work on participatory justice and her exchange with Rainer Forst in adding insult to injury sheds light on identifying key problematic elements in these ontologies of the political. Both Fraser and Forst work within a discourse theoretic paradigm and share a basic approach to justice, namely that its emancipatory ends are best fulfilled when, quote, it makes the critique of institutionalized injustice its priority, or as Forst terms it, putting first things first. Despite this shared aim of yoking an account of justice to the critique of power, they differ in their choice of principle that governs their normative models. For Forst, the procedures of justice are governed by a principle of justificatory fairness, whereas for Fraser, it is the principle of participatory parity that must be paramount. Fraser claims that her principle of participatory parity will achieve deliberative outcomes that are fairer and more legitimate than Forst's idea of justification, because it has a much broader understanding of the types of power asymmetry that hamper the ability of individuals to participate as equals in political life. Forst's principle of justificatory fairness turns around the successful implementation of principles of, quote, generality and reciprocity within the syntax of justice claims, and thus only really ensures its egalitarian effects once subjects are already securely situated in the political sphere. His focus on argumentation is what Fraser terms a circuitous route to underlying issues of power, which are filtered through the proxy of syntax, whereas her parity standard tackles head-on prior asymmetries across all social practices that potentially render individuals politically unequal. Many injuries of distribution, recognition, and representation are not reflected in the formal process of argumentation, and their inegalitarian effects are often realised in insidious and pervasive ways that may escape the rules of procedural fairness. Fraser goes on to make several other claims about the limitations in modality and scope of Forst's justification model of justice, all of which relate basically to his restricted focus on procedures and practices of justification, at the expense of a fuller account of the context of social inequalities in which these procedures and practices are always ineluctably situated. Fraser concludes that Forst's model falls into the error of politicism, namely the tendency to impute a conceptual priority to the political realm by considering it in isolation from the social and economic realms. This politicism fails to do justice to, quote, the complexity of structural causation in capitalist society, and cannot therefore conceptualize dialectically entwined sources of power asymmetry in contemporary society. Fraser's idea of politicism is similar to the notion of social weightlessness that I want to pursue here, and that, in my view, is often caused by the generalization of linguistic dynamics to explain central features of the political realm. Fraser touches on the troubling entailments of this linguistic universalism for the critique of power when she summarises the difference between justification and participation models of justice in terms of their underlying ontologies of personhood. Fraser shares with Forst a political conception of the person, namely one which highlights features of personhood that a non-sectarian theory of justice must presuppose. Forst, however, deploys a primarily discursive conception of the person as, quote, givers and receivers of justifications who participate with one another in the social practice of exchanging public reasons. Whereas for Fraser, persons are understood in a fuller sense as co-participants in an indeterminate multiplicity of social practices, where practices of justification are but one of the many social practices in which individuals ought to be able to exercise their free and equal personhood by participating with one another as peers. In short, she claims that the idea of participatory justice invokes a more, quote, capacious, variegated, and historically open-ended view of social personhood than the restricted, discursive concept of the justification model. A Bourdieusian way of expressing Fraser's critique is that, in Forst's view, political subjects are conceived primarily as linguistic rather than embodied beings, and political participation is conceived in terms of an abstract linguistic competence. As Bourdieu puts it, that everyone participates in language as they enjoy the sun, the air, or water. This linguistic universalism presumes that individuals have, to a greater or lesser degree, a roughly equal linguistic capacity to participate in debate, and indeed, all of whom have accepted a priori the necessity of participation in the political realm. It is easy to see the attraction of language for thinking through progressive models of democracy. It provides an inclusive and universal framework for political participation, whilst being sufficiently thin to accommodate problems of so-called deep difference. The difficulty is, however, that the formal model of language upon which these democratic ontologies are often based tend to underplay the possible barriers to equal or full political participation that flow from the embodied experience of domination. The separation of linguistic competence from embodied social existence is, according to Bourdieu, entirely artificial, a form of symbolic denegation which fictitiously brackets off relations of power and forgets that, quote, linguistic relations are always relations of symbolic power, and that, quote, the theoretically universal competence liberally granted to all by linguists is in reality monopolized by some. What this linguistic universalism fails to acknowledge is that the capacity to speak is not always a formal universal competence, but a statutory ability directly related to one's social situation. Some of the deepest barriers to equal participation in debate cannot be discerned from the perspective of an abstractly endowed capacity to deliberate, because they only ever emerge in an embodied context. There are types of symbolic power inescapably associated with embodied being, one's sex, one's race, one's class, which means that some speakers will always be taken more seriously than others, and indeed some speakers, even when they conform to the rules governing discourse, will not be heard at all. And I'll just refer you to John Mediaris's critique of deliberative democracy from a civil rights perspective on that. These kinds of asymmetries often operate below the radar of formal discursive prescriptions that claim to guarantee in advance an equal right to participation. In other words, there is often too quick an assumption of political agency in certain types of normative theory. Obviously, universal participation must be one of the most fundamental normative presuppositions of democratic theory, but the result is frequently that the barriers to political participation that face marginalised and powerless groups are not considered in sufficient depth. This is what Kevin Olson has called the paradox of participation, that the necessary assumption of universal participation promotes equal agency while simultaneously marginalising the people it's designed to help. This paradox is by definition never fully surmountable, but Nancy Fraser goes much further than many normative thinkers in the attempt to think through what she calls this circularity from the side of power. Her multidimensional idea of participatory justice resists the too ready assumption of equality as an unthematized condition of possibility of political life, and thinks more exhaustively about the effort required to realize equality in conditions of social inequality. She achieves this partly by her dialectical style of thinking, which eschews the frequent reduction upwards where social relations of power are misleadingly conflated with linguistic dynamics, resulting in socially weightless accounts of the political that occlude deep dynamics of domination and inequality. A similar concern with the inclusion of power in normative thought is also expressed by Chantal Mouffe, who claims that many of the most prominent liberal and deliberative theories of democracy are profoundly anti-political. The stress they place on the transcendence of conflict through consensus fails to recognise the constitutive role of power struggles in social life, and consequently also misrecognises what is really at stake in politics. Unjustifiable asymmetries of power are an ineliminable feature of all social and political relations, and therefore any stable democratic order cannot be the outcome of rational agreement, but rather must itself be a hegemonic imposition which, even when it appears to be inclusive, will itself be founded on unforeseen and potentially unjust exclusions. Given the centrality of struggle to social life, it follows for Mouffe that the essence of a vibrant democracy resides not in the containment and supersession of conflict, but in the flourishing of disagreement and contestation within an agonist framework. Mouffe is at pains to point out that the agonist institutionalization of conflict is not an expression of Machiavellian realism or a laissez-faire pluralism, but has an explicitly progressive aim. It is always linked to the struggles of marginal and subjected groups against equality. Agonist pluralism is, she claims, a radical, not liberal one, where, as she puts it, one must differentiate between differences that exist but should not exist, and differences that do not exist but should exist. Conflict, in Mouffe's view, is a guarantee that a democratic order is alive to demands from below. Yet it is in this key assertion that it is driven by an attentiveness to the voices of the marginalised, excluded and dominated that the central failing of Mouffe's democratic agonism lies. Her version of agonism finishes in the most rarefied form of politicism or social weightlessness because of its reliance upon a theory of power which in fact is not a theory of power at all, but a generalised theory of signification, unable to capture basic dynamics of oppression and inequality in anything other than the most formulaic terms. In other words, Mouffe's work is marked by a linguistic version of the universalism that she regards as so problematic in theories of deliberative democracy because of the abstraction from the context of power in which all political practice is situated. I don't want to go into this in much detail, but just to give one example, it is well known that Mouffe, and of course the Cloud, generalise the famous post-structural logic of the constitutive exterior to explain the formation of political identities, which, she maintains, engenders a radical view of democratic citizenship. Once it is accepted that all identities are relational and therefore, quote, precarious and temporary articulations, ideas of democratic citizenship need not be constrained by having to appeal to the pre-given interests of individuals, but in fact can radically recreate these interests along progressive lines. One of the central tasks of agonism is to articulate new forms of collective identification that inculcate in citizens a passionate adherence to democratic values and also create new political alliances that ensure the inclusion of marginalised groups into the democratic order. Emerging as they do from an essential non-fixity or undecidability, identities are always potentially open to reconfiguration, and Mouffe frequently repeats the mantra that all identities are, quote, contingent and precarious articulations, that, quote, every identity has a nomadic structure, and that, quote, the history of the subject is the history of her identifications, and there is no concealed identity to be rescued beyond the latter. When viewed from the abstract perspective of a relational theory of signification, it is no doubt the case that identities might lack fixity. When viewed, however, from the perspective of embodied power relations, they are often found to have a phenomenal depth and durability that, whilst not inevitable, is not necessarily that easily amenable to agonist reconfiguration. Take, for instance, the idea of habitus, which proceeds from the same initial assumption as Mouffe, that identities are contingent in that they are culturally arbitrary norms, but unlike Mouffe's etiolated account that empties identities of any existential depth, it stresses that these contingent norms are realised as deeply entrenched bodily dispositions. Identities, on this view, have an entrenched historicity insofar as the objective tendencies of the world are incorporated into the body and lived and relived as inevitable natural dispositions. In Borges' words, the body believes in what it plays at, it weeps if it mimes grief. When identity is understood not just as a position in discourse, but also as an embodied orientation to the world, the process of creating radical new forms of citizen identification becomes considerably more complex. The internalisation of domination may create complicities, for instance, on the part of subjects with their own oppression, which are often lived as profound psychological and emotional dispositions, feelings of powerlessness, for instance, which present considerable barriers to political mobilisation. Even when individuals perceive their problems as politically articulable and redressable, their willingness to participate in corrective political action is far from assured, as there is, as Jane Mansbridge has shown, a huge difference between recognising injustice, identifying systemic domination and common interests, devising strategies for action, and finally feeling able to act. It is not feasible to assume political agency without inquiring first into how the experience of inequality and suffering might impose deeply felt constraints upon individuals' willingness to act as agents in their own interests. When Mouffe extrapolates from her linguistically derived notion of antagonism and undecidability to claim that the democratic political sphere should enshrine disagreement and conflict, one might ask what kind of capacities she is attributing to her citizens to be able to endure perpetual agonism. At the very least, the toleration and celebration of conflict as a necessary democratic ethos assumes a certain level of political virtuosity and commitment that, arguably in an era of democratic deficit, is not especially evident amongst citizens. When she claims that the job of the democratic political sphere is to convert politically violent, potentially violent social antagonisms into a safer form of political agonism, she gives no indication of what is to be done about those subjects who, for whatever reasons, cannot or will not participate in the political sphere. She has little to say about social antagonisms which do not take the form of explicit or zero-sum tensions between groups, but instead are latent structural strains that are incorporated into the body and lived as seemingly natural and inevitable physical and psychological dispositions. How are such embodied antagonisms to be converted into a productive form of political agonism when they are often largely silent, pre-rational, or unarticulated? Furthermore, why should the ability to tolerate conflict be a self-evident political good? At some level, does the capacity to do so not speak to being in a position of relative power and privilege vis-à-vis political norms and practices, and not in a position of relative powerlessness, where permanent contestation may be experienced as profoundly alienating? Mouffe's theory of agonism is a particularly stark expression of the tendency that Fraser identifies as politicism, where the political realm is given primacy over other social practices and identifications, without really being accompanied by any compelling justification of why this primacy of the political should be the case for many individuals. Political theorists often argue in response that it is precisely the failure to understand the political in its ontological dimensions that remains at the root of our current incapacity to think about politics in a genuinely radical way. Mouffe does, for example. It is possible, however, to claim the opposite. It is a tendency of many types of current political theory to get stuck in certain received ontological givens that lies at the root of the inability to think about progressive politics as interventions in the world, not just as abstract dynamics of undecidability. The distinction between the ontological and the ontic often conceals a troubling failure to think about the realm of instituted practices through sufficiently complex and differentiated models of power, and to retreat into apparently radical but phenomenally empty notions of political agency. The tacit privileging of the ontological over the ontic downplays the logic of existing struggles in favour of abstract notions of radical change. Existing attempts to change the world appear to lack intrinsic interest and have significance only in that they are always incomplete empirical instantiations of more radical foundational dynamics of indeterminacy. In the light of what Bruno Bostiels has described as this eschatological, even catastrophic desire for radicalisation on the part of the left, a focus on the actual dynamics of domination and emancipation often becomes tantamount to a reductive metaphysics of presence, and are endowed with the negative aura of being merely positivist, sociologist, empiricist, or ontic. The risk of this turning away from the actual is that the gesture of radicalisation may very well have disabled in advance the pursuit of truly emancipatory actions, insofar as the latter will always necessarily appear far less radical. The problems of this unqualified politicism are also evident in the Arendtian turn taken by many feminist theorists in the last few years, for example, Linda Zerilli. Zarrilli's Arendtian agonism emerges from a similar concern as that held by Nancy Fraser and others, with the restricting effects that a limited notion of identity politics has upon the feminist political imagination. Following Arendt, Zarrilli argues that politics should break from the subject-centred logic of identity and what she calls the vicious circle of agency to discover a more radical notion of freedom as world-building practice that seeks to instate as yet unanticipated modes of being. She derives this idea of inaugural creativity from Arendt's notion of the future uncertainty of action, or what she terms the abyss of freedom, that we cannot know in advance or limit the potentially transfiguring effects of our actions upon the world. But again, if we turn to underlying questions of power, and particularly those pertaining to embodied agency, one asks what kind of subject is presumed who, amongst other things, has the capacity to expose themselves to and to act according to such future-oriented indeterminacy. Not unlike Mouffe's absolutized notion of undecidability, Zarrilli deploys an unqualified idea of temporal indeterminacy as a cipher for political action, whose emancipatory content is weakened by its disregard of the parameters of embodied existence and agency. It is certainly the case that the future-oriented dimensions of action render social existence more fragile and uncertain than is often acknowledged, and may also reveal the abstract potential for change. It is one thing, however, to assert an essential temporal indeterminacy as a condition of possibility of action and interaction. It is another to trace out what this might mean at the level of social relations, which, even at their most informal, are often ineluctably embedded in entrenched hierarchies of power. Social action and interaction are certainly indeterminate to some degree, and this is what gives social life its open-ended quality. However, action and interaction are also determinate in they are mediated through embodied tendencies and social structures, and are therefore relatively predictable and conformist, and routinely contribute to the reproduction of systemic inequalities of race, class, and gender. Even the most radical account of political action must reckon with what Bourdieu calls this resistance of reality, if it is to have critical purchase. By emptying the idea of world-building creativity of phenomenological content, Zarrilli can say little about the substantive contours of radical political agency other than a vague gesture towards an unanticipated otherness, or what, in another context, Nancy Fraser once termed an abstract promise, that things could be otherwise, but that airily disregards the logic of existing struggles for change. It is only then, in the most general sense, that Nancy Fraser can be said to share Zarrilli's worry with the restrictions of identity concerns upon the feminist imagination. Unlike the latter, Fraser's analysis proceeds not from the questionable desire to rescue a purified notion of the political from the social question and the subject question, but rather from the desire to situate the political within an account of the complex, uneven, and discontinuous relations that it has with other social realms. Commenting on the future of feminist political thinking, Zarrilli recently suggested that feminists should no longer be content to ask the woman question in political theory, rather they should ask the political theory question in feminism. But given the widespread tendency to politicism in political theory, we might ask why this should be the case, since it doesn't seem to get us very far in thinking through the complexities of gender equity or equality in general. In Fraser's view, the major challenge that faces contemporary normative theory is to understand the political implications of the restructuring of social relations taking place under globalized capital. Within this general problematic, a particular challenge for feminists is to confront how many of its apparently progressive ways of thinking about identity formed in its second wave have been co-opted and to varying degrees de-radicalized by the rise of a recuperative new spirit of neoliberal capitalism. This cannot mean, Pace Zarrilli and other agonist thinkers, abandoning the subject question as a theoretical dead end, but instead involves, in Fraser's words, reconnecting struggles against personalised subjection to the critique of the capitalist system. Indeed, if following Foucault and others, we understand some of the most insidious effects of neoliberal capitalism to reside in a depoliticising governance of the self as enterprise, then the subject question and associated ideas of identity and autonomy have a renewed significance in political thought, even though they may need to be conceptualized in more materialist terms than the predominantly cultural orientation of much that feminist theory has perhaps allowed. Take, for instance, the issue of care, which is still too easily dismissed by many, including MOOF, as a paradigm of essentialist identity thinking or as representing particularist ethical concerns. Care, or rather its deficit, is one of the central problems facing both traditional and post-traditional societies, and understanding its complex ramifications involves a multi-dimensional analysis that connects the affectual and psychological dynamics of care work to a broader account of gender and class inequalities, which themselves must be situated in the context of global trends in migration. An increasing population of elderly, the growing entry of women into the workforce, and the neoliberal privatisation of types of social provision previously provided by the welfare state are amongst the factors that have led to the emergence of care deficits in Western democracies. These deficits have been filled to a large extent by the migration of female workers from poorer countries that, whilst providing them with much needed employment, also compounds certain patterns of gender and racial inequality. Migrant labour is cheap, and this exerts a downward pressure on an area already characterised by low pay for its predominantly female workers. The privatised nature of many of these migrant solutions also creates new inequalities of class and gender around the distinction between care commanders and care providers. As a result of female migration to rich countries, poorer countries are also drained of a supply of emotional labour, leaving them with a care deficit too, whose effects are as much psychological as material. Feminist work on global care change, for example, draws attention to the damaging emotional ecologies that are the consequence of female migration, where effectual surplus labour is displaced from the migrant worker's own children, from whom she is separated for long periods, to the children she is paid to care for. In sum, the issue of care simultaneously raises many of the gender-related injustices of recognition and redistribution that Fraser noted long ago in her celebrated essay on the universal caregiver, along with the more recent inegalitarian effects of global migration, which she has also lately incorporated into her work under the dimension of representation. There are many interesting normative solutions that flow from these dilemmas of care. As well as Nancy Fraser's idea of the universal caregiver, I refer you to the work of Kathleen Lynch and others on effective inequality. All of them offer political remedies which operate on several different levels at once, from the remodelling of interpersonal dynamics between men and women, to the reorganisation of the family unit, to issues of systemic distribution of care at a universal level. It is this multi-dimensional style of political analysis that proceeds in tandem with a sociological attentiveness to the ordinary dynamics of oppression and struggle for change that, in my view, renders Nancy Fraser's work an exemplar for thought on radical democracy, rather than the unidimensional models of the political that are currently so prominent.